Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. It is the MK.7 hand-and-a-half sword from the Art of Iron and Fire. And some disclaimers before I get into the review. One, this is a free review sample from the Art of Iron and Fire, so tip of my hat and special thanks to them for sending it my way. But do know I didn't spend any money on it, so if you think that makes me biased, then you know at the start. Two, it'll be obvious when you see me move it around, but I do not study HEMA. I study other styles of swordsmanship, but none of them are historic European martial arts. So moving it around, the context, the feeling of it, I can't apply it in any kind of system. I'm not educated in that way. Keep that in mind. And the last bit, which I feel is important to know, and I'm not playing on your sympathies, I'm not trying to anyway, but my elbow seems to not be uninjured. I'm working on it. It's rehabilitating, but I'm moving it around slightly diminished condition. So keep that context in mind. I feel it's important to know those things at the start so you understand my musings and ramblings and at least some of the biases that may exist in them. Anyway, on with the show. So this is a 315 euro blade, at least in the configuration that I'm looking at it, which is this black cord wrapped with a simple black leather scabbard. I believe they go up from there. There's some customization options, but I'm not terribly familiar on exactly what they are. I believe, though, this one is about $315 because the euro and the dollar are pretty similar, at least at the time of recording this. That could obviously change quite a bit, though. So for $315, it's comparable to many other kind of mid-tier swords, bearing in mind that it comes with a scabbard. It's kind of in the same price point as a windless sword might be. At least some of the less expensive ones. It's less expensive than Dark Sword Armory. It's kind of in the same price point as the Ronin Katana European line of swords. That's generally the competition that it's in. But as I look at this sword, it bears a striking resemblance, at least in silhouette, to the Albion Fiore. The pommels are quite a bit different, but the length, the general shape, the look of them seems to be very similar. And I've included in the description measurements, dimensions, all that kind of stuff. But also I've included those from the Albion Fiore because I reviewed that one some time ago. And you can compare and contrast those two things. It's not a fair comparison. The Albion Fiore is $880, or at least it was when I reviewed it and that did not include a scabbard at $315 with a scabbard. Again, very, very unfair comparison. But in silhouette, they look similar. I thought it might be worthwhile to compare and contrast the two of them below. And I'll talk about that when I get to the end of the video a little bit more. But anyway, $315 is roughly the price point I'm keeping in my mind as I think about how it moves around and what expectations I have for this sword. So I'm going to go kind of soup to nuts, top to bottom. Hopefully it's helpful. I'm going to start with a pommel, the end bit right here. And first I want to note that I really like it. Frankly, it's chamfered. The edges are smoothed out in such a way it still has a crisp look in my mind, or at least crisp enough. It doesn't have some of the same sharp lines and clean edges that the Albions do, but I can run my hand over it, and if I swing and hold the pommel or hold the fat of my hand near the pommel, it doesn't pound into the meat of my hand in such a way that it's uncomfortable. Now, I understand that some historical systems use blades that have wheel pommels, and that's kind of baked into the system that you're using. I don't generally tend to like them, but as I noted earlier, I don't study any style of historic European martial arts. I get to see what looks pretty and fits nice in my hand and swing that around and enjoy it, but I'm not trying to learn any historical systems or anything like that. So as far as wheel pommels go, though, this is reasonably comfortable. Like I said, it doesn't jam into the meat of my hand. Nothing on my skin catches if I'm using it without a glove. Because it's cold outside as well, when I went out and tested it and moved it around, I did move it around in a glove, and that was also no problem. Though I've had that experience with wheel pommels as well. It didn't tear up my gloves, though, I suppose is the other thing. I was using simple leather gloves outside, and it didn't kind of chew into them, which I may have had other wheel pommels do. Anyway, simple look. It's got a kind of larger cutout in it. It's overall reasonably smooth. I like the transitions to the grip as well. There wasn't any kind of yucky bits or schmutz. It seemed to transfer pretty well. Oftentimes there's like this little ledge, at least if I think about swords in this price category, there's like a little ledge or problem where the pommel transitions to the grip, it overlaps or it's off center or some other thing. This transitioned, I thought, in a way that was very elegant for the price point. The peen was rolled over. It looked like there was a peen in there and that the tang of the blade ran through the pommel and was peened over. The peen also looked like it was not round. It looked like it was a rectangular section, and that kind of bears out because the pommel came off. Spoiler alert, the pommel came off at the end of the video. But the peen was rectangular, and I can kind of see that at the end. It was buffed off reasonably well. Nearest I can tell, though, these pommels are made from some sort of alloy. It doesn't appear to rust. It's very similar as well to the Ronin katana fittings that I've seen as well. They have similar characteristics in how they patina, how magnets attach to them, the general look. They kind of have a kind of off, I don't know, just a slightly different color difference compared to steel fittings, but they don't rust the same way, and I don't think they're stainless steel. But anyway, I digress. Point is, I like the pommel, and I like the way it was peened on. I thought it was elegant. I thought it was well done for the price point. If I move up to the grip, this has basically a cord wrap grip that, again, bears some similarity in silhouette to the Fiore, in that it's octagonal or hexagonal around the where your right hand would go, or where your main hand would go into the crossguard, and then it narrows down and almost turns into a cylinder towards the base. Not quite. It still is easy to index. It's still easy to tell where the edge is. I like the grip in one hand. I like the feel of it in my right hand, but where the grip narrowed, I didn't find it was particularly easy to hold on to. I found myself just grabbing onto the pommel as opposed to holding onto the grip, and keeping my kind of wrists in line with the grip when I was cutting. I thought it was just easier to grab the pommel. It got a little bit too small for my hands, at least it felt that way in gloves or not. Either way, I didn't find that smaller section to be as comfortable, but I did like the other part of the grip where my right hand would go. I thought it was easy to index. It rested well in my hand. I felt like it was secure. It didn't move around. The cord wrap didn't come undone. All in all, I thought the grip actually was reasonably comfortable. Those grips that generally narrow down to a really small bit before they meet the wheel pommel, it's common for me not to like those. It's not that this one in particular didn't do it well. It's just that this style of grip isn't one that resonates well with me. I tend to hold on to the pommel, and that's what I did, and I was very happy that the pommel didn't chew my hands up. Anyway, the grip has nice subtle ledges to it. Nothing's terribly sharp. I thought it indexed well, and it stayed very secure in my hand. If I held onto the sword and twisted it in my hands, it didn't move around. I could really lock it in and feel like I had good control over the weapon. Also, the cord wrap, it wrapped around and didn't come loose, and I did abuse the sword. I tossed it around quite a bit, but over the course, the wire wrapping on it didn't come undone. That was also a treat, because that wire wrapping doesn't seem to be glued on. It looks like the construction of the grip is basically a wood handle that has some epoxy resin that fills in the gaps as it's slid over the tang. There is a peg that goes through, like a makugi, a bamboo pin that goes through the middle of the grip as well. It's wrapped over with cord so you don't see it, but that also offers some additional security to kind of keep it in place. I didn't find, though, that the cord wrap, which historically in just simple cord wraps, when they're not secured down with lacquer or some sort of adhesive, they tend to move around and break off. That wasn't the case here. It held up all the way through the end of my silly shenanigans with the sword. Moving up to the crossguard. I really happen to like the crossguard. It has, basically no ripples or issues in manufacture. It seems to be pretty well done, and it has some elegant swoops and stuff like that in it. I thought the edges were also nice on the hand. None of them bit into the meat of my hands. None of them caused me to bleed. Sometimes the ledges of these things are so sharp after they're manufactured that they kind of chew into my hands if I choke up on the crossguard, which maybe you're supposed to do or not. But in my case, I tend to bring my hand pretty close to the crossguard, and if there are sharp ledges on it, then I tend to find out the hard way. In this case, though, it was overall very comfortable, and it gave me the impression that the grip was a practitioner's tool. Nothing came undone. I felt in control of the weapon. None of the ledges bit me, and it had an elegant but simple appearance. The crossguard as well, I should note, seemed to hold up reasonably well. Now, I struggle with how to test crossguards because I've braced them on things, then hit them with swords, and that's not exactly fair to make them perfectly stationary and absorb all the shock. That's not realistic. In this case, I didn't have a great apparatus or tool or jig to test them, so I did some makeshift things. First, I basically jammed the crossguard into a tree, right? But just my body, and I'm pushing it into a tree like I'm trying to stop a spear shaft or something like that. And the crossguard didn't bend, it didn't deform. Everything seemed to hold up really, really well. I could push it hard enough where it kind of lodged itself into the tree, and I thought that was sufficient. From there, though, I did smack the crossguard around a little bit and kind of bumped it with a piece of rebar, and eventually the crossguard did deform. At least it bent just a little bit, but it took a lot of force to get it to deform, and I'm happy to say that it didn't basically just shatter and break. bent a little bit. It does give me the impression, though, that this may be similar to the Ronin Katana swords that I've tested, where the crossguard is a bit on the soft side. So it'll take a strike, it will deform before it shatters, but it may bend a little bit easier than you would hope it would. That seems to be the experience, but you can take a judge for yourself. I was pretty happy with the fact that I could jam it hard enough into a tree where it lodges into the tree, and it still held its shape. But subsequent tosses into a tree with force or beating it with rebar, that caused it to deform a little bit. Other notable bits about the crossguard are where the handle or the grip meets the crossguard. Again, the transitions here I thought were really elegant. It didn't overlap. It seemed to be really well placed. It's a little nuanced for a simple made grip and a budget sword, but I appreciated the attention to detail here. It was overall well executed. On the reverse side, where the blade meets the crossguard, you could make out some epoxy resin. There is a gap in here, and I know the gap has been recently a subject of some debate. I understand historically gaps are present from a modern manufactured standpoint. I personally prefer when they have very little gap around them and the tolerances are very small. It's a very small nuanced thing and not something frankly expected in this price point. In the $300, $400, $500 range, if you get something with a very tight tolerance between the crossguard and the blade, great, but it's not expected. It wasn't something that happened on every sword in period. Depending on what your preference is here, just know I guess there was a gap, and here it is. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the scabbard, and this is a simple black leather covered scabbard with a metal chape at the end, or the little metal bit that seems to be made of the same type of alloy as the other fittings, but I could be wrong on that. The leather here doesn't seem to be of a particularly remarkable quality, but again, temper your expectations for a sub $500 sword. It's perfectly within reason for what you're paying here. At $315, it seems pretty okay. The leather adheres to the scabbard reasonably well. If I push it around, there's no like loose spots. It's not coming undone. There is it rattles basically if you shake the sword in the scabbard, and it falls out if you turn it upside down. Recently, there's been some debate about what is acceptable here. I'm only noting that that's what happens when you do it. Whether or not it's good or bad is up to you. Personally, I prefer something similar to a Japanese style sword where I can move around, and if I bend over, the sword doesn't fall out of the scabbard. I like the amount of tension to be such that it will hold in if I turn it upside down, but if I pull it or give it any force, that it's not easy or not hard, terribly hard to draw. I understand that's a challenging thing to do, especially with changes in humidity and all that, but it is something that frankly the user can adjust. There's little bits of wood gluing and stuff like that that you can do to shim the mouth of the scabbard so that it has the appropriate tension for your desire. In this case, it arrived to me in such a way that it rattles and it falls out if you turn it upside down. I suppose. There you go. Other bits to note about the scabbard is the belt system. I think it came with one, or at least it has buckles on it to attach to one, and I believe it came with a belt that I haven't been able to find after my move. I don't know that I would necessarily trust it. The leather on it didn't seem particularly of a great quality, but it seems a great starting point if you have another belt system that you would prefer using. Regardless, though, it comes with a scabbard on a sword for $350, and it's not bad. It comes with a metal chape, and it gives an overall handsome appearance. The other echelons of swords that they have, the higher tier ones, seem like they have more elaborate and interesting scabbard systems with better leather and materials used. It seems like a worthy thing to do if you're interested in having a sword with a scabbard. All right, onto the blade, the pointy stabby part. So details and measurements on the blade are in the description down below, again, as well as a reference to the Talhofer. There are some subtle differences in thickness and distal taper and all that, but this one, notably, does have some distal taper, as noted in the description down below. Notably, in terms of contrast to other Type 15 swords like this, or long swords, the hand-and-a-half swords like this that seem very thrust-centric, it doesn't have a reinforced tip. It kind of tapers off. And while I was testing the blade, I thrust the blade into a tree, and then I was going to try and smack it out of the tree with the rebar to test the grip. But I kind of, well, it didn't work out the way I planned, and the blade kind of folded over in the tip that was stuck in the tree, and it bent horribly. So the temper on the blade does seem as well to be within 50 to 55 HRC based on the measurements that I was able to take with the files. The 50 file didn't bite in, and the 55 file bit in everywhere. The 50 file kind of bit in some places along the core on the base, but not really so much. So anyway, those are the measurements I was able to take. It seems to be consistent all the way through anyway. It didn't seem like there was a lot of variation in different spots as I tested it, but the blade did bend pretty substantially when I thrust it into a tree and then kind of lost my grip on the blade, and I could never quite get it back from there, and it continued bending in that spot. Otherwise, it seemed to flex back as well. It's a through-hardened blade, and it seemed pretty flexible. If I pushed it into a tree and bent it quite a bit, it would come back to true, but I guess losing it and letting the tip bend is too much for it in that regard. So anyway, blade profile is like a Type 15, nearest I can tell. It has some pronounced distal taper over the course of the blade. It thins out quite a bit, though, rather than having a reinforced tip. I was also able to take a grinometer, or some sort of edge measuring device that I have, and it looks like the edges are roughly 17-degree bevels. It's kind of tough for me to tell exactly, though. There's no specific point, but nearest I can tell, they appear to be ground at about a 17-degree angle. And it was also pretty consistent grinding. It didn't look like it wavered a lot and moved around as I was looking at the edge geometry on the blade and taking a look at the way the edges were ground. They weren't particularly sharp, though, so in terms of cutting, I'll talk about it later, it didn't do necessarily the best, but the edges are ground well and give you a place to start if you want to put a razor edge on it. Beyond that, though, the features are pretty simple. The grinding was clean, reasonably clean anyway. There's some surface rippling on here, but I would call it minimal, especially given the price point. Also, the central ridge doesn't seem to wander. It stayed pretty true all the way out to the end of the blade. And that was nice. And there's one other facet of the blade I should mention before I talk about cutting, and that is the tang. So eventually the pommel came off, and I was able to expose the tang. It changes. It has a hexagonal shape near where the crossguard meets the blade. It tapers down to a rectangular shape, but still keeps some meat on it. And after, well, basically in the transition of the grip, kind of where after the main portion of your hand, after your primary hand, and it transfers down into a smaller grip, it thins out a little bit. So the manufacturer mentioned that this could be to save weight. I don't think it's saving a huge amount of weight, but it seems like the tang is reasonably reinforced in the parts that are most sensitive. I did want to note, though, that eventually the pommel came off. It seems like that could be a potential weak point, but I'll talk about that in more detail when I get to it. All right, so cutting. The cutting of the blade, it basically just didn't go well. It didn't cut pool noodles particularly well. I took just basically a honing stone and went over it on one side a little bit. It didn't make a big enough difference to really impact cutting. It was an amazing thruster. I felt like I had a lot of control over thrusting, but I didn't have really any good experience in cutting with it. It would need to have a keener edge put on it than what was on it in order to be a functional cutter, but this seems to be a little bit more of a thrust-centric blade. And in that, I felt like I had a lot of control over the thrust, and it certainly thrust into things pretty well, especially where I bent the tip. When I thrust it into a tree, it penetrated the tree quite a bit, over an inch from a kind of a one-handed thrust, and that was well, very impressive given the profile of the blade, and that it's wintertime and the trees are frozen. So I was impressed with how much penetrative power there was in the thrust of the sword. It seemed to work out pretty well. It seems like it does a better job at thrusting, at least into wood and the like, because it doesn't have a reinforced tip, but that reinforced tip, you pay a little bit of a penalty for it, given that it thins out quite a bit in that section. Cutting-wise, though, again, did not have a lot of luck. All right, well, I can talk about moving it around now. Usually I talk about moving it, and then I talk about cutting. In this case, the cutting didn't go so well. I didn't continue with it, and I did go on with just moving it around. And I can say that it's really a delight to move around. It bears more similarity to the Albion Mercenary than the Albion Fiore, in that I feel like I can move it around with one hand. I feel like I can thrust and be in control with it. At the same time, it doesn't feel like it's as great at defending. It's not as cumbersome to move around as the Fiore was. It doesn't have the same reinforcements. It's not as thick, and that bears out with the measurements below. But it is fun to move around. It's nimble, agile. I feel like there's a lot of tip control. Hopefully that it's, substantiated as well by the measurements of the weapon dynamics computer that's linked in the description. But moving it around and doing basic forms and cuts, I felt it was easy to get tip speed, easy to stop, easy to put the point where you wanted it, and overall it was a very fun practitioner's tool. I could see how if you're trying to do drills or forms or something like that, and you're looking for a sword that's nimble and can give you point control, this is a fun one to move around. It's not particularly light at over 3 pounds, but given the size of the sword, that's not so bad. The point of balance is also pretty low on the sword at 3 inches, again similar to the Fiore, but it feels lighter and more nimble in the hand for some reason, despite the similarity in proportions. All right, well, now I'm going to talk a little bit about the abusive side of things. Not to say some of the stuff I've done already hasn't been debatably abusive, but I'm moving into the definitely abusive territory wherein I'm throwing it at a tree. And I understand throwing it at a tree is not a scientific test and it's not a historical one, but it does put a lot of shock into the sword. And if I can throw it at a tree about 10 times and actually hit the tree, or even if it hits the dirt and it holds together, it's usually a pretty well-made thing, and there's a reason that it holds up. And if something breaks, it sometimes, because of all that shock, can expose failures in the sword, and I think that's what happened in this case. So what happened from throwing it at a tree? Well, the tip bent, and I didn't bother bending it back, so there's no cool glamour shots of it sticking and penetrating deep into the tree. The tip bent, kind of folded over, and it was almost like a feather tip at that point. But I digress. Point is, I threw it at a tree. The crossguard started to deform, and you can see in the crossguard there's some metal fatiguing that appears to be present here. I've seen this on other Ronin katana swords as well. That's why I think they might be made of the same type of alloy. Regardless, the crossguard held up, but it did deform substantially more doing this than it did in some of the other tests. Also, the blade seemed to flex. There were some times that it did hit directly on the tip, and the blade would flex, and it still stayed straight, so the blade didn't bend off at all. But at some point, the pommel did crack, or something like that. I threw it at a tree several times. It struck on the flat, it struck on the pommel, it struck on the blade. I missed the tree a few times, but eventually something happened that caused the pommel to crack in such a way that when I threw it, the pommel came off before it hit the tree, and I was able to find it in the snow, and the peen appears to have broken off like just before the end, because I can still make out the area where it appears to be peened, but the tang cracked in such a way that the peen came off. Now, I had forgotten that the owner or the manufacturer had mentioned that there's a peg that runs through the grip, and that would have held it on in such a way that I could have continued, but I think the grip actually, or that peg, also failed because there was quite a bit of space between the crossguard and where the grip had come off, or where the pommel had come off. The grip had slidden around a little bit, and that indicated to me that that bamboo peg had failed. It's also a bamboo peg. It's not particularly resilient, so maybe a brass peg or something like that would have kept it a little bit more secure. But that additional reinforcement, certainly, I think kept the entire grip assembly from coming off, as well as some of the epoxy and stuff like that, kept things pretty tight in there. Theoretically, I could have continued. I didn't feel like it was safe, though. To me, the pommel coming off is a critical failure, and it's time to stop the testing. The tip rolling over, well, honestly as well, it's a little bit of a, I'm kind of glad that the pommel came off, because I wasn't intending on bringing it to the croquet stick of doom and pushing it any further. I'm not in a condition where I feel comfortable doing that at this time. But the pommel came off, and to me, this is a good enough reason to stop. I didn't feel comfortable continuing, even though there was a peg that ran through the grip, and theoretically I might have been able to do that. This to me is calling it. It's a critical enough failure where I feel like I should stop testing. So that is what happened. That's eventually what caused it to fail. If you want me to push the blade to failure, or you think there's any value in doing that, let me know in the comments down below. And when my elbow heals up, then maybe I can revisit it and see if I put the grip back on and put a brass peg in, how many licks it takes to get to the center of the Tootsie Pop. But the steel itself seems to be pretty well done on the sword. I think that just might have been too hard around where the peen is. I don't know why. Maybe it was overheated. I can't exactly tell you, but it is uncommon for pommels to break off, particularly in the peen area. I've seen them break where the after the pommel. I've seen the entire pommel come off, particularly when it's cold, but not break off in that section and then come off. That's a first. Anyway, that's the story. That's what happened. That's using it. That's my feedback. That's the measurements. And hopefully that's enough information to help you decide if it's worth your hard-earned money or not. It's time for me to answer that question, though, myself. Do I personally think it's worth $315? The answer is yes, but kind of only just. I'm on the fence a little bit. And the pommel breaking off is really the elephant in the room here. I see that as a critical failure that really shouldn't have happened. The pommel bending would have been acceptable, but kind of cracking and falling off, even during those abusive tests, is really not an acceptable thing to have happen. I would say no on that ground, but at the same time, there's so much other nice stuff about the sword, given the price point as well at $315, that I'm kind of on the fence. I did have to abuse the sword. I threw it several times at a tree, missed it. It hit other things in the back. It's winter. Pommels, for some reason, seem to pop off a little bit easier in winter as well. I threw it at a tree. I did abusive things. I thrust it into a tree. I hit logs and things like that. And it took a long time before it got to that failure point, and the way it failed seems like you may be able to actually fix it if you're handy. Not that you should have to, but I'm pretty convinced that if you were to do more normal things and not throw it at a tree, that you wouldn't experience this kind of issue. And the blade itself, where most of the meat and potatoes of stupid things is going to happen, seemed to hold up pretty well. It didn't damage, the edge didn't deflect, the tip bent over doing stupid things, but other than that, the blade seemed to hold up really, really well. So, well, I agree. It's well, at least my argument would be it's not acceptable that the pommel broke off. It's not necessarily a deal breaker given the price point and given the other performance characteristics and given the other benefits. It's a joy to move around. It has nice distal taper. It has good edge profiles, even though they're not what I would argue is sharp enough to do the types of activities I want. They're at least clean and well done. The lines and profile of the blade are nice. The transitions on the blade are nice. It's a handsome blade, and again, at $315 with a scabbard, it does not seem like a terrible deal. Anyway, I'm going to say yes, but kind of only just, and I'm kind of on the fence at either one. I would like it to be improved, and I would venture a guess that the folks at Iron and Fire are probably going to see this video and make a point of improving this particular facet of it. So I'd hope that future iterations of the sword, the Mark 8, if you will, addresses the issue where the pommel may be a little bit more secure. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Hopefully it's helpful to you. That's all I've got. Special thanks again to the Art of Iron and Fire for sending the review sample over. Hopefully the video was interesting. Cheers, and thanks for watching.